Good evening. I'm Nina Zaneri, Executive Director of the Paul Revere Memorial Association, and I'm so glad you joined us tonight. The iconic statue of Paul Revere, thanks to Cyrus Dallin's creative influence and talent, is how we all would want to be remembered. Trimmer, younger, and better looking. I believe Paul Revere himself would approve of how the statue looks. The statue has become one of Boston's brand images, appearing on promotional materials, Boston police patches, advertising, and from time to time, festooned with sports jerseys after an important win. The association's most direct link goes back to the dedication in 1940, when our former board president and direct descendant, Paul Revere Jr., then a lad of 8, was tasked with pulling the rope to lift the drape at the unveiling. He tugged, and nothing happened, and tugged again to no avail. Then another stepped up. An Irish cop on duty provided the necessary assistance, and the statue was revealed. I once asked Paul what Dallin was like that day. Paul replied, he looked tired. Tonight's talk will explain why that was likely an accurate observation. And now my colleague Robert will introduce tonight's program.
Excellent. Thank you, Nina. As Nina mentioned, my name is Robert. I'm Robert Schemp, the Research and Adult Program Director for the Paul Revere Memorial Association. We are so excited to be able to bring this joint programming to you tonight, bringing and bridging a couple of different audiences together from the Paul Revere House and the Cyrus Dallin Art Museum through this, as Nina said, really, truly compelling story of how the Paul Revere statue in the Paul Revere Mall or Prado in the North End came to be. As we begin, I do just want to kind of give an update and flag to our viewers, if you're around the Boston area or if you plan to visit Boston sometime in the coming year as your health and safety allows, both of our museums are open and available for tours. For the Dallin Museum, small group tours are available by appointments on Saturdays and Sundays by contacting the museum directly. And for the Revere House, we're open at the moment Wednesdays through Sundays next week from 10 to 4:30 p.m. So keep an eye, of course, on both of our sites, the websites. Feel free to contact us at any point for any updated times and dates. So all safety regulations, of course, will remain in place for the time being. And we'd also like to thank all of our generous viewers, the support you've all given us this year, the support from our sponsors, certainly for the lasting support through this COVID period, especially the Boston Cultural Council for its programmatic support in April. Now, in considering tonight's topic, I personally certainly remember, as I think probably many of you do that have been to Boston before, the Dallin's Paul Revere statue from doing the Freedom Trail for the first time, seeing it certainly positioned with the Old North Church rising behind it. I remember mine was a freezing December day the first time I saw it. But honestly, the first time I'd seen it, not in person, and oftentimes was through, of course, nationally, as Nina kind of alluded to here, nationally televised sports games that would include any of the Boston teams. It's usually a pretty standard, B-roll shot, background shot to fill in for Boston at large. And as Nina alluded to as well, we've certainly seen Paul wearing a few different jerseys over the last few decades. My point being in all of this, as it even for a kid like me growing up in central Illinois, the statue itself, and I think Paul by proxy, became shorthand for many people's perceptions of Boston and the American Revolution. So in that sense, I think the statue, perhaps even more so maybe than Longfellow's poem, at least in our time, has become kind of a starting and entry point really to learning about Paul Revere, his house, and certainly its legacy. So with the statue in mind, I think it maybe has a little bit of an outsized importance now, at least compared to what Dallin intended back in the 1940s, but perhaps not. So to think a little bit about the statue itself and some of Dallin's intentions, we are very thrilled and honored to welcome tonight's speaker, Nancy Blanton. Nancy is the group tour coordinator for the Cyrus Dallin Art Museum. She has lived in the Boston area for her entire life and is passionate about the New England art scene. She loves sharing the story of Cyrus Dallin sculpting career and especially his advocacy for Native American people's rights by coordinating tours and special programs for both children and adults. She frequently travels throughout New England to enjoy biking, hiking, culinary adventures, and perhaps unsurprisingly, visiting museums and historic homes. Before joining the Dallin Museum in September of 2018, Nancy completed a museum studies program at Northwestern University. And before that, she worked in financial services industry in downtown Boston for over 25 years. So we're thrilled for the program tonight. As we go on, you can feel free to add comments and questions off to the side. We will get to your questions at the end of the talk after Nancy finishes, so feel free to toss those along as we go. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Nancy, to take it away.
Thank you so much, Robert and Nina, for the lovely introduction. I'm so happy to be here to tell this incredible story to you guys. It was certainly one that stood out during my first visit to the Dallin Museum, because I'd never heard the story before, and it's just absolutely amazing. So I'd just like to start my presentations on behalf of the Cyrus Dallin Art Museum to state our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the Cyrus Dallin Art Museum is located on the ancestral lands of the Massachusetts tribe, the tribe of indigenous peoples from whom the colony, province, and commonwealth have taken their names. And we pay our respects to the ancestral bloodline of the Massachusetts tribe and their descendants who still inhabit historic Massachusetts territories today. Robert, can you? Yeah, thank you. But not for me, we want to see the museum. Founded in 1995, we are located in Arlington off of Massachusetts Ave, just steps away from the Minuteman bike trail. And I hope that what you learn from the presentation today piques your interest to come and visit once we fully reopen, to hear all of the other great stories of Dallin's works, achievements, and activism. Cyrus Dallin was a celebrated American sculptor, educator, and indigenous rights activist who lived and worked in Arlington, Massachusetts for over 40 years. He was born in 1861 in Springville, Utah Territory, a small Mormon settlement in the shadows of the Wasatch Mountains. I'll quote Cyrus. There was a clay bank between the Ute encampment and the settlement. When we got tired, we used to sit down at the clay bank and make models of the animals that roamed the prairie in those days: antelope, wolves, buffaloes, and horses. That was where I got my liking for modeling, there at the clay bank beside the village of Ute teepees, end quote. And modeling in clay grew to be more than just a fun pastime, as Cyrus's exceptional talent became very apparent early on. And in 1880, at the age of 18, with the financial support of 2 local businessmen and proceeds from his parents' mortgage, Dallin moved to Boston to study with sculptor Truman Bartlett at his studio on Federal Street. Regrettably, Dallin and Bartlett had a bit of a tumultuous relationship. Dallin was living in meager quarters and often starving, so he left the studio to pursue opportunities that Bartlett did not necessarily approve of. I gather Bartlett felt that despite his enormous talent, confidence, and drive, the frontier upstart was audacious in contradicting his advice and not showing due respect to him, an important Boston art critic. Dallin went on to spend 2 extended periods of study in Paris in the 1880s and the 1890s, a necessary rite of passage for any young sculptor seeking to establish his or her reputation in the field. He studied with Henri Chaput, with whom he had a much better relationship, at the Académie Julienne. It was from Chaput that Dallin learned the principle of the Beaux Arts style, which emphasizes classical forms infused with naturalism and emotional intensity. In 1900, Dallin became a member of the faculty at the Massachusetts Normal Art School, now called the Massachusetts College of Art and Design, in Boston. And during his 40 years tenure at the school, he mentored a generation of Boston sculptors. He was a passionate yet patient instructor, and students fondly referred to him as Cyrus the Great. Dallin was a very prolific sculptor. In addition to his iconic Paul Revere monument, other important historical subjects include the Anne Hutchinson Monument at the Massachusetts State House and Massasoit Usumikwan in Plymouth. His commissions were not limited to the New England area, and he received a number of commissions from the Mormon Church, his most impactful being the Angel Moroni, an iconic symbol of the Latter-day Saints Church that sits atop the Salt Lake Temple, as well as temples all over the world, including Boston. Signal of Peace in Lincoln Park, Chicago, and Medicine Man in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. While Dallin sculpted many different subjects, he was most passionate about portraying this land's indigenous peoples. As a child, Dallin became close with the Ute families who lived near the Springville settlement, and he maintained relationships with them throughout his lifetime. His sculptures of indigenous people were intended as personal reflections on humans that he admired and public commemorations of indigenous resilience in the face of ongoing subjugation. Dallin spent the last 20 years of his career fiercely criticizing American imperialism and passionately advocating for the rights of indigenous peoples. Dallin served as president on the Massachusetts branch of the Eastern Association of Indian Affairs, a national organization that partnered with Native and non-Native groups on efforts to protect land rights and sovereignty, improve health care and education, and revitalize Native arts among indigenous nations. Dallin was viewed as a trusted ally and a collaborator by indigenous leaders, and was one of the few non-Native members of the Algonquin Indian Council of New England. Through his work, Dallin pioneered the role of the artist as an agent of social change. For instance, the equestrian form was historically reserved to pay tribute to Anglo-European military figures. But Dallin recognized and respected Native American historical figures using this type of imagery. He also adopted the heroic nude as indigenous commemoration, and his Massasoit Usumikwan shows the Native leader as a counterpart to Michelangelo's David, drawing a parallel between the story of David and Goliath and indigenous peoples and colonizers. And now that you've had a little introduction to the life and works of Cyrus Dallin, let's move on to the topic of the evening, his quest to raise the Paul Revere Monument. In October of 1882, Mayor Augustus P. Martin of Boston established a committee to lead an effort to erect an equestrian statue to the memory of Paul Revere in Copley Square. The committee was comprised of members of the Boston Board of Aldermen, the Massachusetts Grand Lodge of Freemasons, members of the Revere family, and the Massachusetts Charitable Mechanic Association, for whom Dallin completed his first commission, their seal, for which he earned $2. The committee issued circulars inviting artists to send models in by April 19, 1883. A $300 cash prize was offered for the entries that best represented Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride. Entries were unsigned to ensure impartial judging, and the young Dallin was almost certainly enticed by that cash prize. In just 3 years after arriving in Boston, Dallin entered Waiting for the Light. His was one of 8 models submitted in the competition. The committee was impressed with his work, as well as by entries from Daniel Chester French and James E. Kelly. All 3 men were chosen as finalists. When it was revealed in the press that a 21-year-old novice from the West was chosen as a contender for this important commission over more established sculptors, Bostonians were incredulous, and Dallin found himself the target of such critical characterizations as Utah's cowboy sculptor and the youth from the godless Mormon city of Salt Lake. The Monument Committee did not select a winner due to growing debate over the historical accuracy of Longfellow's poem. Paul Revere did not wait to see the light in the belfry of the Old North Church. The signal was meant to inform patriots in Charlestown of the route of the regulars if something happened to Revere that prevented him from riding. The committee therefore declared all entries historically inaccurate. Additionally, the committee had hoped to consider an entry by Thomas Ball, sculptor of the George Washington statue in Boston Public Garden. Ball had been working in Italy and had missed the contest deadline. In May of 1883, Dallin submitted a second model for a runoff competition with Daniel French, Kelly, and Ball. Dallin's second model presents Revere, quote, on his horse with a very spirited, unconventional, and vividly dramatic pose and gesture. Reining back his excited steed, the midnight messenger points with a straight arm in the direction he has come, and his tense and anxious face almost speaks the message he bears. Thomas Ball's eagerly anticipated submission did not draw favorable reviews from critics. One such review stated, quote, if Ball himself were to view this lack in his work, speed and motion, and compare it with the spirited action of Dallin's plaster cast, he would confess that the neophyte got ahead of the veteran in one respect at least. And despite such praise, the committee remained undecided, still concerned about Dallin's age and lack of experience, assuming the commission would be too much for him to carry out. However, in June of 1884, Dallin was notified that the Revere Committee was ready to negotiate with him, providing he make a few alterations to his model. So he set to work and finished model number 3, which was studied by the committee, who suggested additional alterations. Dallin completed these edits, and the model was sent to the Boston Art Club on November 11, 1884. The committee finally approved the model, and the persevering Cyrus Dallin had finally won. The year-and-a-half competition had come to a close. Unfortunately, the announcement in the Boston Evening Transcript said that Charles E. Dallin was a successful artist. Wonderful reviews of Dallin's model were printed in many Boston newspapers. The horse is marvelous, the pose is splendid, said the Boston Herald. It may be said to represent in a deeper sense the fire, enthusiasm, and patriotism of the Revolution, said the transcript. We think Mr. Dallin has comprehended the spirit of the incident, expressing its picturesque phase well, and has given us a dashing work, not especially learned, not too profound, but effective and enthusiastic, said the Boston Advisor. Praise of the model came also from renowned Daniel Chester French, whose wife described Dallin's mixed emotions in winning the commission. She stated in her book, Memories of a Sculptor's Wife, quote, he was somewhat overwhelmed by the fact he was not an Easterner, that he knew he would be looked upon as an outsider, and that he went down to his studio the next morning somewhat discouraged and blue. The first thing he saw was a small note pushed under the door. It was from Dan French saying, I congratulate you. Yours was by far the best model. I'm glad you won. End quote. Dallin and French would become and remain friends, and Dallin sought and appreciated French's creative eye on work such as appeal to the Great Spirit. Dallin was to receive $25,000 and 2 years to complete this project. He signed the contract and returned it, but by some oversight of the committee, Mayor Martin failed to sign the contract, rendering it invalid until July 4, 1885. Martin was not re-elected to office on July 4, 1885, an updated, revised agreement for the statue was signed by Mayor Hugh O'Brien and Dallin. Unfortunately, the revisions included loopholes that might limit the sculptor's artistic freedom, provided no city funding for the pedestal, and included a clause releasing the mayor and committee members from personal responsibility should their funding efforts fail. This new contract brought unexpected opposition rather than fresh hope. Early accounts mention only that the Revere project failed due to lack of funds, but later sources revealed that the public confidence for the project declined after a disparaging letter from Dallin's former teacher, Truman Bartlett, was printed in the Boston Transcript. In this letter, Bartlett severely criticized Dallin's model, declaring it, quote, an impossible man on an impossible horse, end quote, and protested against the award of the commission to such a youthful and inexperienced sculptor. And without much of any excuse or explanation, the committee practically scrapped the whole project. After returning from an extended stay in Paris, Dallin was devastated to learn that his award-winning third model had disappeared from the gallery where it had been exhibited. He then completed a fourth model. According to Dallin biographer Rel Francis, this model showed, quote, a maturity of modeling and surface design that reflects Dallin's European training, end quote. While the model was well received in the press, the monument project continued to lack leadership and political will. And in 1899, after a lapse of almost 10 years, Dallin created a fifth model in an attempt to renew interest in the monument. His new composition incorporated design elements of his two earlier works, most notable the raised front foreleg of the third model, and a larger, more refined version of Revere from the fourth model. Mayor Thomas Norton Hart renewed Dallin's expired contract and gave the Boston Art Commission responsibility for the project. In December of 1899, the committee officially approved Dallin's fifth model. It was exhibited and viewed by Governor Winthrop Crane and other public officials. It received a glowing review from the Boston Transcript, asserting that Dallin, quote, never ceased to improve upon his original work, working on it in season and out, and remodeling it at least 5 times, until, in the judgment of experts, he made of it a plaster work well worthy of a prominent location in Boston. In 1900, a newly formed monument committee issued a public appeal to citizens of Boston to help raise $20,000 to fund it. The effort was unsuccessful, and the project languished once again. Meanwhile, in 1907, Dallin contracted with P.P. Caproni and Brother, a Boston plaster casting company, to sell reproductions of the model in various sites to collectors and educational institutions. The Cyrus Dallin Art Museum is proud to exhibit a plaster Model 5. Now, I realize we've been going on for a while now, but just imagine how Cyrus Dallin must have felt. Remember, this monument was his first and last major work. And here we see what Dallin looked like when he began working on the monument in his early 20s, and then still toiling on model number 5 into his 70s. In later years, Dallin reflected upon the frustration he had with the competition and noticed, I was disappointed, but not defeated. I learned that life is full of disappointments, but I have also learned to leave disappointments behind me and to go on to something else. Very wise words, Cyrus. 3 decades later, Dallin once again sought to revive the project by creating a 6th model, which he exhibited at the R.H. White department store on Washington Street in Boston. With the exception of Revere's full billowing cape, the model is best described as a mixture of elements from his previous designs. While the statue received national attention in the press, Boston officials made no attempts to revive the long-stalled project. Just want to show you model number 3 again, because Dallin came across a photo of his long-lost third model while going through his recently deceased friend Frederick Hall's things. And this discovery prompted Cyrus, now in his 70s, to reflect on this important achievement of his youth. So guess what? He began work on a new 7th model and unveiled it with an appeal to Boston Mayor Frederick Mansfield and trustees of the George Robert White Fund to support the effort. This fund is a trust that was left to the City of Boston to support beautification projects and still exists. While Mansfield made a promise that the monument would be erected, the White Fund determined that the monument did not comply with the provisions of the trust and declined to support it. And at this point, Dallin took matters into his own hands. And with the help of his son Lawrence, he set to work on a full-sized, heroic scale rendering of the statue in clay at his own expense in his Arlington studio. The work took him 4 months to complete and required 3 tons of clay, some of which was hastily obtained by the sculptor's devoted students at Massachusetts School of Art. His wife, Victoria, described the ordeal. Quote, "For months he toiled, handling great quantities of clay, going up and down a ladder day after day, from morning till night, working with feverish intensity. The cost of such mental and physical exertion for a man in his 70s was tremendous, and Cyrus was a mental and physical wreck after the huge model was completed." End quote. The 10.5-foot statue was subsequently exhibited at the Boston Historical Society and began a public campaign to pressure the city officials to act. In 1936, the design received the approval of the Boston Art Commission, and P.P. Caproni and Brother reproduced the equestrian in plaster with a faux bronze patina and exhibited it in their Washington Street gallery. However, funding remained an issue, so in 1937, Dallin offered to sell the monument to the town of Arlington, with the prospect of it being erected in front of the high school. Pressure over the possibility of losing the monument may have motivated Boston officials to fundraise more aggressively. Dallin allowed the city of Boston to exhibit the plaster equestrian on the Esplanade during Art Week, and over the next 2 years, the statue was exhibited in public spaces throughout the city. This is a photo of the unveiling on the Esplanade, April 24th, 1937, and from left to right at the base of the model, we see Dallin, Police Lieutenant Thomas F. Harvey, Governor Charles Hurley, young Paul Revere, our Hamer, great-great-great-grandson of Paul Revere, and Elliot Wadsworth, president of the Boston Chamber of Commerce. In the fall of 1939, Dallin reached out to Mayor Tobin and the White Fund for financial support once again. This time, his request for support took the form of a parody of Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride. And I invite you to visit our YouTube channel to hear our museum founder and Dallin expert, James McGuff, recite this version of the poem, which is just fantastic. Look it up. And finally, in December of 1939, the administrators of the White Fund voted to finance the Paul Revere Monument. On January 17, 1940, Dallin signed a contract with the city of Boston. The statue was to be cast in bronze and placed in the Paul Revere Mall, the Prado, between Hanover Street and the Old North Church. Dallin was to receive $27,500 for the statue, a mere $2,500 more than the monument, than the amount he was to earn from the original contract back in 1884. Dallin's sons Lawrence and Bertram were upset by this meager sum. Their father had expected to receive about $80,000 for the work, and Lawrence initially objected to the terms. But Bertram compelled the family to accept, saying, "The money doesn't count, just do it anyway. Our father needs this." And just when you think the story might be coming to a reasonable conclusion, heated discussions ensued between the Dallin family and the White Fund manager, Joseph O'Connell, over where the statue was to be cast. O'Connell insisted the casting be carried out by T.F. McGann and Sons in Somerville, Massachusetts. But Dallin preferred the Gorham Company of Providence, Rhode Island, who had been casting his work in bronze for many years and whose fee was half the cost of McGann's. Meanwhile, staff at P.P. Caproni and Brother, including gallery manager seen here, Leo Toshke, had commenced preparing the sections of Dallin's statue for shipment to the foundry, until this shocking event occurred. With a Caproni studio worker as a witness, quote, "Gangsters with a big sedan stole parts of the model. It looked like they had guns and everything. They walked right in and knew just what they were after and took the essential parts," end quote. Caproni had no choice but to send the remaining sections of the statue to McGann for casting. The Dallin family made the difficult decision to refrain from publicly accusing officials of wrongdoing, fearing doing so would delay the project even further. The Paul Revere Monument was dedicated on Sunday, September 22nd, 1940, and the ceremony featured band and chorus performances and speeches by high-profile Bostonians such as Mayor Maurice Tobin, City Councilor Henry Shattuck, and Joseph O'Connell. The statue was unveiled by Paul Revere Jr., as Nina had mentioned, a 9-year-old direct descendant of the Patriot, shown here in the newspaper clipping with Cyrus Dallin. Unfortunately, what should have been a happy day for the family was overshadowed by tragedy. Cyrus and his wife Victoria had been informed in June that their son Arthur, who had joined the French Foreign Legion during World War II, was missing in action. And according to the Boston Post, when several thousand people cheered as the statue was revealed, quote, "Cyrus Dallin said nothing. He bowed when he was introduced, but that was all. Watching him, spectators got the impression that his heart and mind were too filled with emotion to permit him to do anything but sit quietly in the sun while the orators praised the name of Paul Revere and the deeds of the early patriots." Despite the sad circumstances, Dallin's work of 57 years had become a reality. What was his first major success had also become a capstone of a long and influential career. Some 72 years later, on April 29, 2012, the Paul Revere Mall in Boston's North End was the site of a celebration of the now internationally known landmark, and to honor Cyrus Dallin's 150th birthday. Mayor Thomas Menino declared Cyrus Dallin Day and presented a proclamation to the Dallin family and the Cyrus Dallin Art Museum. Making the occasion extra special was participation by dozens of family members that descended from Dallin and Paul Revere. In the photo on the top right, from left to right, are Mayor Menino, David Kubiak, he's a friend of the Cyrus Dallin Art Museum, who orchestrated the whole event, Jean Dallin, the green jacket, Paul Revere Jr., the now 81-year-old boy who helped pull off the sheet during the original dedication ceremony, and shaking hands with David is the one and only James McGuff, founder of the Cyrus Dallin Art Museum. Also, among many in the bottom group photo in the back row is Jean Dallin in the green jacket and Judith Dallin with the short red hair. In studying the history of this story, I've come to reflect not only on Dallin's enormous skill as an artist, but his tenacity in the face of bureaucratic and financial challenges that might have driven the average man to throw in the towel. Luckily for Bostonians, Cyrus Dallin was no more afraid of a nearly impossible idea than was Paul Revere. And with that, I conclude my story and invite you to please check out the Cyrus Dallin Art Museum on social media. Visit our website at www.dallin.org to learn more about our collection, special events, take our virtual tour, or visit our donation page. Thank you all so much for listening.
That was terrific, Nancy. What a story. So many twists and turns.
It must have been exhausted.
honestly, so many models, which is always shocking to me, just how many models he had to go through to get to the final product. And as you say, 57 years from start to finish.
Yep.
Incredible. I mean, I think there are a lot of, your talk leads into a lot of different questions, and we have a few coming in the chat for sure. One thing that I was curious about, though, is the location of the statue. I mean, it has such, as you alluded to, as I alluded to a little bit in my talk too, has such an iconic presence today on the Paul Revere Mall there, steps down from the Paul Revere House, and of course with Old North Church certainly framing it to some extent. But can you talk a little bit about the process for the statue actually ending up where it did, rather than somewhere else like Copley Square, perhaps?
Yes, well, so as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, Copley Square was where it was planned to go in the first place. And I'm guessing that given the time span here, maybe something else found its way to that location. But in my official reading, I read that there was a meeting at the Old North Church in January of 1935, attended by Mayor Frederick Mansfield. And he was reviewing the story of the drama of this competition and all these models of the statue. And he promised that it would be erected, but he suggested that it be placed near the Paul Revere Mall, which was a newly man-made park, had been recently constructed through financial aid from the White Fund. So that's the same fund that was funding the monument. So it's like kind of keeping those things together, which I think worked out incredibly well, given the fact that Paul Revere was from the North End, lived and worked in the North End. So I think that location might be better than the original one.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And as you say, a lifelong North Ender for Paul Revere. Hardware shop, iron foundry, certainly his silver shop. And even when the Revere sold what we, of course, know now as the Paul Revere House in 1800, they still maintained a residence on Charter Street. So I think you're absolutely right that there is a very fitting aspect to where the statue ended up. We had a question come in too about these various models, and I have been wondering about them as well. To your knowledge, have for the ones that are extant today, have they ever been in similar locations, exhibited together, or kind of been in the same place in our modern times together at all that you know of?
Not that I know of, and I believe that the whereabouts of a majority of them are unknown. So I don't know if they got scrapped and used for something else, but well, I know the third one went missing. And
right. Yeah, it's certainly possible. Maybe I think you're right, scrapped for something else. And with some of these things, as we always see, with the Revere House in terms of collections too, you never know when something's going to pop up as well. It could be in a private ownership with a family somewhere else. Who knows? So
on eBay.
Right. Yeah. Got to keep an eye out in all venues for sure. Yeah. We did have a question on Dallin's religion as well. I mean, we certainly see a lot of where he's from out west. Certainly see some important monuments, LDS monuments early in his career as well. Was he a Mormon, practicing Mormon in his religion?
He was not, actually. I believe that his parents left the Mormon faith before he was even born. And Cyrus was a Unitarian, as far as I know. So I think that they were just pleased that the LDS Church just recognized the son of Utah, and that's why they had offered him the commission for the Moroni. He wasn't particularly a man of faith either. He didn't really believe in angels. So and it was kind of on the fence about taking the commission, and his mother encouraged him, take the work you can get. This would be nationally recognized, and as a mother would, I think. And he took it,
right.
And there it is now.
Right. I mean, on this point of parenting as well, I wonder if maybe you could speak a little bit to some of the sons you refer to, Dallin's sons here towards the end of the piece. Did any of them follow in his footsteps?
So Bertram and Lawrence did not. I'm actually not sure what they did, but I know that Arthur was a noted stained glass designer. And his works can still be seen in churches in Concord and Ackworth, New Hampshire, as well as the Park Avenue Congregational Church in Arlington on Paul Revere Road. And Arthur is the one that I had mentioned at the end of the presentation. The Dallins found out that he was MIA. I think they got that news in June of 1940. And then after the model was erected in the North End, they found out in November that he had in fact been killed in action. And he had joined the French Foreign Legion because he was born in Paris in 1898 when Dallin was studying there. And he always felt an allegiance to France, the country of his birth. So he chose to join the French Foreign Legion instead of the U.S. military. Wow, interesting. Such a kind of transatlantic connection here, both for Dallin and then obviously continuing on then to that next generation there. Now, we did have a question. I think Emily maybe covered it in the chat, but just to reiterate, because it is such a great video. Can you remind, and you alluded to it in the chat there, but can you remind visitors where to see the founder of the Cyrus Dallin Art Museum reciting that poem? Yes, well, so the Cyrus Dallin Art Museum, we have our own YouTube page, and I can share a link to that. I don't know if it was on my list there, but it's the latest video of our founder, James McGough, who tells the story like no other, and he does a really fantastic job reciting that poem, the parody of the poem. I remember the first time he did it, like it's kind of a segue into the gallery where the Paul Revere materials are. And he starts with a "Listen, my children, and you shall hear." And you figure you know where it's going, but then it's this other version, and you're like, what is this? And it's just really excellent. Oh, thank you. Someone just posted it on there for me. It just came up on the banner where you can find it. So, yeah, definitely check that out. James McGough has absolute panache, and it's very well recited. And as you say, the poem zigs where you think it's going to zag in terms of that one. Such a familiar beginning that then goes obviously in a different direction. Question coming into, I'm guessing that we might not know on this one, but it is certainly a compelling one, I think, about all of these various models that we maybe don't have physically, but certainly have some images and depictions of them for how they've gone on. I do wonder, maybe this is just a general one to have in the ether, but if there's ever been discussion that you know of any of those other ones being completed or taken up, somewhere else. Not that I know of, Robert. I'm afraid not. Well, it would be interesting, because again, there just are so many, or the depictions, I should say rather, the depictions that you've shared here are really quite good. Actually, I'm surprised that, they were tracked along as he was making them. So, perhaps maybe an intrepid sculptor watching in tonight wants to take up one of those that we had there. Well, model number 3 was his favorite, and that's why he was just particularly upset that it went missing. Right. Model number 4, I think, might not have been the most popular one. I think people were not crazy about the halting braced leg posture of the horse. But it's around, it's out there somewhere. I just don't think we know at this time.
Do you have a particular favorite? Any of them stand out to you, or does the finished one hold the cake?
I like 3 a lot, and I like number 5. I think that maybe because number 5 is the one you see so much, other than the one in Prado, because he did contract with P.P. Caproni to reproduce number 5, so you see it a lot in collections, private collections and museums have the 5, and I like it.
Right. Well, you've mentioned 3 a few times, and especially it going missing, but we also have other missing components, right, to this story, as you alluded to there at the end. Do you have a sense of or can you tell us a little bit about what you know of that was stolen as part of the as we thought we were reaching a conclusion here? Of course, that one of the last twists and turns of the story.
Yeah, that really is a shocking twist. And yeah, the parts of the model that were stolen, well, apparently gangsters love horse heads. So they stole the horse head, and they stole one of Revere's arms and one of his legs. And as far as I know, the thieves were never apprehended. And the account that I read says that these pieces mysteriously turned up at T.F. McGann's studio. So they were really pushing that.
Yeah.
Extreme, I guess.
Right. We have a question coming in from Michael here, indicating that he seems to see maybe a shift in artistic genres or fashions, maybe as these models progressed. Could you speak to that at all, or maybe even not at specificity, but maybe how they also tracked along the other work that Dallin was doing in his career?
Sure. I think that some of the later models do reflect some of his study of the Beaux Arts style, just a more natural or more flowing poses. But the edits that the committee had requested, I'm not exactly clear on what those are. Because the models that as the progression goes along, they're not that different. So these tweaks, I'm not really sure, what they weren't crazy about. I mean, 4 is certainly different than most of the others, like I'm mentioning that braced leg posture again on the horse, but the others kind of have the same flow to them, except for, which one is it? Number 6 with the billowing cape.
Right. And in terms of his progression, then, I'm both interested in some of the other work that Dallin did, and I think at one point, I think you had mentioned, as he was reflecting, back on, kind of the lengthy process. I think you said, quote, "I have also learned to leave disappointments behind me and go on to something else." So it seems from your talk that was both in terms of production and in terms of teaching as well. Could you maybe speak to some of the teaching that he did, and any notable connections that we know of from some of his pupils?
Sure. So he, one student of his that comes to mind, the name is, kind of like Cyrus Dallin. A lot of people don't know his name, unfortunately. But this female sculptor, Bashka Paif, she was 13 years old when she enrolled in the Mass Normal Art School and studied under Dallin's tutelage. She graduated from there in 1911, I believe, and went on to study at the School for the Museum of Fine Arts. But she has a couple of pieces that you can see in the area. One's in Boston Public Garden, her Boy and a Bird fountain. And there's also a Lexington Minuteman memorial. It's a relief sculpture. It's near on the Visitor Center Green in front of the Buckman Tavern. And it depicts several armed Minutemen, getting ready to defend their homes. It's quite striking, keeping with that colonial history theme. Right. I think she completed that in 1948. So there's student pieces of his that we've probably all seen, just had no idea.
Right. and in terms of his lasting influence, whether pupils or to our modern day, we have more of a personal question coming in here for you, Nancy. What kind of drove you and sparked your interest in Dallin and his work?
I think it was just the fact that, being from Boston, two iconic images are Paul Revere Monument and Appeal to the Great Spirit. And I did not know who the artist was. And then I found this little museum in Arlington that is packed with incredible things to see and learn. Like, how do we not know this? These are icons of the city of Boston. So learning more about him and his Native American advocacy. I love Appeal. I think it's beautiful. And Massasoit is incredible. It's just been a great experience learning about him and his activism and the interesting challenges he experienced along the way to creating these icons.
Right. I mean, I think that the story, as you say, both has that kind of hyper local, connection. It has this broader connection to, American history and certainly art history as well. But to some extent, I mean, this is so much of a story about, just personal trials and travails and perseverance. So in that sense, I mean, I really do think that there is this this profound human element to the story that all of us can connect to in one way or another.
They tested his patience for sure.
Absolutely. Now, one thing that did stand out to me too of interest is when you were talking about the 1880s process. I certainly, being connected to the Paul Revere House, I found it very interesting that early on in that process, there was already this pushback against the accuracy from Longfellow's poem relative to, to this process as well. And with certainly the Dallin Art Museum being in Arlington, I just want to say that seems like such a fitting connection for April to be bringing up, right, as we're kind of moving towards Patriots Day and Patriots Day programming. That's certainly something that that we seem to grapple with every year, the accuracies and this broader legacy of Longfellow's poem.
Yeah, I think using that as a reason to scrap that first competition is a little lame in my opinion, because you can't really tell that in his positioning in that first one that he's waiting for a signal from a particular vantage point. So it's a little finicky, but they really were waiting for that submission from Thomas Ball, I think.
Right. Right.
That's
and we have just a few more minutes here, folks. If anybody else has any final questions for Nancy about the statue, about Dallin's legacy, and about coming into certainly some Patriots Day and Week programming coming up. And I guess I would just finish, Nancy, too, with this idea of any final thoughts for you about what this, you've spoken to this a bit, but what maybe the lasting legacy of either Dallin or the statue is to you, and some of the things that this has meant to you from your work at the Dallin Art Museum, and of course, as you say, being kind of having a lifelong interest in these projects and area.
I think the story and his perseverance is really it is inspiring, and I think it's a really good story if we can condense it, because for attention span purposes, to teach younger visitors, to just you believe in something, just stick with something, and eventually it could lead to greatness.
Right, stick-to-itiveness, as they say, and even if it takes the better part of 6 decades to to get through it.
57 years. Yeah.
Incredible story. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. We're just coming up on our time, so I just want to say again, thank you so much, Nancy, for sharing this wonderful story of twists and turns about Dallin, about Paul Revere, and his lasting legacy with us. This was truly terrific. I learned a lot. I know our audience has learned a lot as well. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you, Robert.
So it was a pleasure to have Nancy here to make this connection with the Cyrus Dallin Art Museum and the Paul Revere Memorial Association. Thank you all so much for tuning in tonight and for being a part of our program here. I would just like to thank as well our sponsors and supporters throughout COVID and through certainly our programming here, especially the Boston Cultural Council. And I think we just have one final question, Nancy, not quite off the hook. This will be the last one coming in here. Any ideas on if there were models who posed for any of these monuments that Dallin did?
I do not know the answer to that question. I did not come across that in my reading. Most of my material came from his biographer, Ralph Francis. But that's an excellent question, and I can dig into that with our curator and director and see if there's some information we can find to answer.
Sure.
That.
Yeah, and it does look like there are perhaps different models as it goes through. So interesting question. So Guy, feel free to reach back out to the Dallin Museum down the road, and we can circle back on that one. So we'll leave it there. Again, thank you so much, Nancy. Thank you all for tuning in tonight. We hope to see you in the not too distant future as safety and time allows. Stay safe, everyone, and thanks for tuning in.